Hello, I'm Paul Perrello, and welcome to the Philly Factor. Well, a drink that was introduced at the 1876 Centennial Exposition right here in Philadelphia this drink harkens right to the very roots, pardon the pun, of the history of Philadelphia. We're talking about the introduction of Hires Root Beer at the 1876 Expo in Fairmount Park, where the majority of the expo was held. Charles Elmer Hires has been described as a tycoon with the soul of a chemist. Hires was not only a pillar of the Quaker community, he also built one of the largest condensed milk companies, and it was Charles Hire who was responsible for introducing root beer at the Centennial. Charles Hires was the Philadelphia pharmacist that introduced root beer to the American people at the Centennial. Here to discuss the work of Charles Hires is author Bill Double. The name on Bill's book, and I'm going to quote it here, is Charles E. Hires and the Drink That Wowed a Nation, the Life and Times of a Philadelphia Entrepreneur. And Bill Double joins us here on the Philly Factor. Thanks for being with us.
Well, thank you.
I always like when I stumble upon something that is sort of tucked away. It's one of those gems in Philadelphia history. We know of Hires Root Beer. We probably have all had a sip or two or more of Hires Root Beer during our lifetime. And yet we really don't know much about the man behind Hires Root Beer. And lo and behold, your book sort of sheds the cloak of secrecy over Charles E. Hires. So tell us a little about who exactly was Charles E. Hires.
Well, he was a New Jersey farm boy, lived in South Jersey in Salem County. At the age of 12, he apprenticed at a drugstore, left home and apprenticed. He received $1 a week, room and board. He spent 4 years as an apprentice. At 16, they offered him a job in the drugstore. This was in Millville, New Jersey, but he had grander plans. He boarded a ferry, went up the Delaware to Philadelphia, debarked at the Arch Street Wharf, carrying a valise and $10 in his pocket. He also had a letter of introduction to a Quaker lady who ran a boarding house. He quickly found a job as a pharmacy clerk in Philadelphia. He worked here. He left that job and worked in a drug wholesalers. By the time he was 21, he had saved up enough money to start his own drugstore.
Wow. Yet he, that's just the opening salvo in his story, because he goes on to be quite the entrepreneur during his career, his life, and his time in Philadelphia.
Oh, absolutely. He was only beginning when he opened his drugstore at 602 Spruce Street.
And the building's still there.
The building is still there, yes. The first significant success he had occurred during a walk down Spruce Street. He saw a pile of lead-colored clay at an excavation site, and he looked at it, he picked up a little and examined it. It turned out to be Fuller's Earth, which was a product of some value back then. In the age before commercial dry cleaning or chemical dry cleaning, Fuller's Earth was used to remove stains from wool and flannel. It was sold by druggists in bulk. But Hires had a better idea. He thought if this clay could be molded into uniform cakes, it would eliminate the messy ritual of selling it in bulk. And it was a very successful product. And
again, it sort of sheds this light on this man who walked the streets that we walk on. He so he goes from Fuller's Earth to root beer. How does he get from this to there?
Well, actually, he launched his drugstore. It became quite successful. When he sold his Fuller's Earth, which he named Hires Special Cleaner, he took payment in credits from the drug wholesaler. So that increased his sales and allowed him to fully stock his drugstore. A couple years later, he got married to Clara Kate Smith. They had a long and devoted marriage. Anyway, the first year of their marriage, they were traveling. They went to another farm in New Jersey, and the hostess served them a drink that she had brewed from roots, berries, and herbs that she had foraged. It was a root tea, and it really intrigued Hires, and he persuaded her to let him have the recipe. He thought he could develop this into a commercial product, which he did.
Yeah, for sure. And it became sort of his empire, the cornerstone of his empire. But I want to go back to when we hear the word root beer, it is derived from roots. Like what kind of roots?
Well, he used 16 ingredients, so there was quite a variety. Probably sarsaparilla was one of the main things. Sassafras, he used vanilla, he used hops, dog grass, something called Titican ripens, a whole host of different ingredients, roots and barks. Yeah.
So he comes up with this concoction. He then knows that in order for it to be a success, he needs to put it on show at the Centennial in 1876 here in Philadelphia.
After he developed his recipe and he packaged it in small packages, an extract in little boxes for 25 cents, he set out to publicize it, and he sold it to local wholesalers. But when the Centennial came up, this was a prime opportunity. This was like the granddaddy of all trade shows up to that time. And he wangled a space there, and he prepared samples of his root beer, and he sold boxes of it. And the public seemed to enjoy it.
Yeah.
And this convinced him that if he could find a larger audience, if he could induce more people to try it, he could sell a lot of root beer.
Now, on the other side of this equation, Charles Hires also knows that in order to convince people to try it, he needs to advertise the product. And so I guess when we look at the success of Charles Hires, not only did he come up with this root beer, but he also was a successful advertising salesperson, because he knew that he had to put advertisements out there in order to get people to try his product.
Oh, absolutely. He was a pioneer in advertising, and he really built his product. He was one of the earliest manufacturers to build a product into a national brand. It happened quite by chance that he got into the advertising. He somehow was acquainted with George Childs, who was the publisher and editor of the Philadelphia Ledger. And they met one day on a streetcar while he was riding to work. And Childs said, "That's a good product you have." He had tasted some, maybe at the Centennial. He said, "Why don't you advertise it in the Ledger?" Well, Harris said, "I can't afford to advertise." But Childs made him an offer he really couldn't afford to ignore. He said, "You advertise in the Ledger, and I'll tell the bookkeeper not to send you a bill until you ask for it." Well, presumably sales would increase enough to pay for themselves. Harris advertised the one inch by 1 column ad for 6 months in the Ledger. When he finally asked for his bill, the amount shocked him. It was $700. But sales were increasing, and somehow he was convinced that he needed to continue to advertise it, which he did. For the next 10 years, he plowed every penny of profit back into advertising, and it just grew like topsy. It mushroomed, and it got into all kinds of other media besides newspapers.
So when he realizes the value of advertising, the sales of his root beer. Now, was it just an extract at the very beginning, or was it, and I think I read in the book that he was actually selling kits for the root beer extract that people could make their own soda water?
He brought it out originally primarily as a home brew. You would buy the extract, you would combine it with water, sugar, and yeast, and mix them together. One little box of extract would produce 5 gallons of root beer, and it would be effervescent because it would ferment with the yeast. It was quite a messy ritual. And originally it was dry ingredients, and you had to first make it kind of a liquid tea out of it. But he soon introduced a liquid extract, which really enhanced the popularity of the product.
So while Charles Hires introduces root beer at the Centennial in 1876, there were other types or forms of root beer that had existed prior to Hires root beer.
There were other, actually root beer goes back a long way. It's a form of small beer, which is a name given to low alcohol beers. And it had existed before Hires came along. But what he was able to do was to promote it in a way that nobody else had done.
The manufacturing plant, then once he's up and running and he realizes he's onto something, does he keep his operation based in Philadelphia, or and where in Philadelphia is his base of operation? I'm sure it's not that drugstore at 6th and Spruce any longer.
No, he got out of the drugstore business actually fairly early, and he became a dealer in botanical drugs, a wholesaler of botanical drugs and vanilla beans, and he made some various flavoring extracts that he sold. But in any event, as the business started to grow, he had to find larger places for it. He finally ended up in 1890 on Arch Street, in the 700 block of Arch Street, in a 4-story industrial building. He incorporated the Charles E. Hires Company at the same time because sales had grown very, very rapidly. One whole floor of that building he devoted to a printing plant, a fully equipped printing plant. And all that plant did was turn out advertising material, trade cards, circulars, point of sale blurbs by the millions. And he knew that was a key part of the business. So
he was pretty forward thinking. He knew he had a product, but he was, as we said, an entrepreneur. So he pretty much was a self-promoter. There wasn't anybody there necessarily helping him. He had the foresight to realize that I have this product here, I have increasing sales, and now I need to promote the word about this. And so he comes up with his own printing plant and come up with his own advertising to, sort of blanket the area with, ads for Hires root beer.
Yeah, I should say he also depended on another pioneer Philadelphia firm, N.W. Ayer & Son, the advertising agency. They were his main ad agency. And it was an era when advertising was just coming into its own. Manufacturers were able to mass-produce products ranging from soap to soup in large quantities, and they turned to advertising to make markets for these products. And N.W. Ayer was a real pioneer in advertising, and they had a symbiotic relationship with Hires, actually. Hires' buys helped Ayer to grow, and Ayer's creative advertising helped Hires.
Yeah. I want to put Charles Hires in perspective here, as well as the 1876 Expo here in Philadelphia, because there was a lot going on at that expo. And so when you think of Hires' accomplishments, look what else came out of the 1876 Expo, like Alexander Graham Bell and the telephone. And there were a few other things that came out of that expo as well that are pretty much well part of our culture today.
Oh, absolutely. The precursor of the electric light was there, and a lot of other things.
Remington typewriter?
Remington typewriter, absolutely. And then there were some lesser products introduced. One was Hires, another was Heinz ketchup, and another was the banana.
Really? Introduced at the 1876 Expo. And yet, everybody probably sits down at breakfast and puts a banana in their cereal, and they just assume that it's always been here, but it was introduced at the Expo.
Yeah.
And one of the last vestiges of the Expo is the home of the Police Touch Museum now, which is Centennial Hall. I mean, that was the main exhibition hall at the time. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so when people, from your research, and I should mention here that Bill is a journalist, or what he calls a reformed journalist, but when you were doing your research for the book then, Bill, what was the reaction when people tasted this for the first time at the Expo? What was the public reaction?
They really liked it, and there were some druggists there, and he made special efforts to make sure that they would take samples home with them. And those became his contacts. People from all over the country visited, and it kind of gave it a wider audience than Philadelphia.
Yeah, and we should say that that expo is perhaps known as really the first World's Fair. You mentioned that people came from all over the country, if not all over the world, to come to see what was on display. Of course, the expo in 1876 was to mark the centennial of the United States of America, but it really was a World's Fair for people to enjoy.
Oh, absolutely, and it was there to promote products, and which it did. All kind of manufactured products and all kinds of, it was celebrating the development of industry and commerce as well as the centennial.
Yep. So what made you decide that at this point in your life you wanted to tackle the subject or the topic of Charles Hires?
Well, I came across Hires when I was doing some research on Washington Square. His drugstore is located about a half a block away, and the more I read about him, the more interested I became. And the other thing that really kind of interested me was there'd been very little, he was very underappreciated, very little written about him, no biographies of him, just bits and pieces, newspaper, magazine articles. That's about it. The other major soft drink makers and the people that invented them have been celebrated widely, particularly the people that developed Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Canada Dry, Moxie, Dr. Pepper, but nothing on Hires. And Hires was, in a sense, really the guy that started it all.
And you mentioned Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola was not on the scene in 1876. Coca-Cola really doesn't arrive until about 10 years later.
That's correct. Yeah. That's correct. And they followed a lot of the practices, particularly the promotional practices that Hires had introduced, yes.
When you embarked on this journey, and we had talked before we started taping the program, is that there was very little in terms of a go-to resource that you could base your research on, but members of his family, great-grandsons, I guess, that are still alive, they were very supportive and cooperative when it came to helping you in your research and looking for some material that could get this project to move forward.
Oh, absolutely. And there was a small archive that had been collected by a grandson of Hires, which I had access to, which is now at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. And that was very helpful too in filling in some of the details. But a lot of what I had to churn up, a whole lot of it came out of newspapers.
Wow.
And there is so much that's available now on the internet.
Sure.
It's really, really helpful.
Yeah. So do you think in hindsight now, as you did all this research and put the book together, did Hires really understand his importance, his magnitude, his contributions to society, whether it was just with root beer or some of the other things that he did during his time?
I think toward the end of his life, he was celebrated by the advertising industry. They realized what a contribution he had made, and I think he realized it too. Yeah.
The name of the book that I want to share with you again, it is available online. The name of the book is Charles E. Hires, and The Drink That Wowed a Nation, The Life and Times of a Philadelphia Entrepreneur. It's a great read. It really is a trip down memory lane, and as I said at the outset of the program, we all have probably had a glass or two of Hires root beer, and this really is the entire backstory into, I never knew that, sometimes you think that, Hires root beer, that's just a name that they came up with, but this was actually, did he want the root beer to bear his name? Was this, was that his decision to make, to put his name on the root beer?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, he was very proud of it. And one of the big problems he had is when it became popular, there became a lot of copiers and knockoff artists that would sell bogus root beers under his name or have used variations of the Hires name, and he pursued them very vigorously in the courts because he had spent all this money on advertising.
Sure.
He didn't want somebody coming in and capitalizing on it.
Yeah. How long does Hires root beer then stay in the Hires family before it gets swallowed up by a bigger company?
Well, Hires' son, his youngest son, in fact, took over as president of the company. The father never really retired. Charles Hires didn't die until 1937. He was always involved in the company, but active management was taken over by his son. He had two other sons who also worked in the business. And then there was a non-family member that worked about 5 years as president, and another grandson of Hires took over as president, and he remained with the company until 1960, when it was absorbed by Consolidated Foods.
It is now owned by the company that owns Snapple, correct?
Dr. Pepper's Snapple Group, which
Yeah.
is now no longer itself an independent company. It's been recently merged with Keurig, the people that make the coffee
pods.
Yeah.
Right. Amazing. Can you still find Hires root beer maybe not in Philadelphia because of the soda tax, I'm not quite sure, but that's a story for another time. But can you find Hires root beer in supermarkets today?
Oh, it still exists. Dr. Pepper Snapple made about 30 different beverages, and 4 of them are root beers. And they still kept producing Hires, but they really emphasized their major brand, which was A&W, and their other root beers. There's a couple bottlers in the country that still make it, one of which is in Ottumwa, Iowa. In any event, you can buy it from Amazon.
You can buy anything on Amazon.
By the 12-pack, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing. Did they, I think I even know the answer to this question, but once it changes from local ownership and it just gets gobbled up down the food chain, do they change the recipe for Hires root beer to a certain degree?
Oh, absolutely. I think they have along the way, and they've added corn sweetener and it replaced sugar, which Hires owned a sugar plantation. In fact, he purchased a sugar plantation and mill just to provide sugar. There was no high fructose corn syrup in that day, so they used that in their. If you read the can today, they use artificial ingredients, which he would never have used.
Yeah. At the height of Hires root beer popularity here in the Philadelphia area, how many people were employed by his operation?
Oh, I can't give you a very accurate number. I would think there were hundreds, though, at the time.
When early in his career as the soda king, if you will, with Hires root beer, was he approached by other legitimate companies to either sell his recipe or come work for them, or like when Coca-Cola arrived on the scene 10 years later, did they want Hires and Hires root beer as part of their kingdom?
And not that I'm aware of. Coca-Cola, of course, grew very rapidly and became like the juggernaut of soft drinks. But I don't know whether Hires was approached. I'm sure at some point he must have been approached about selling the company.
Yeah. In retrospect then, Bill, when you look at your book and knowing all of the research, and how long did it take you to write this book?
Oh, gosh. Going on probably 4 years.
Really?
From beginning to end.
Yes. So with all that labor of love that went into the book is finally published. What is it that you hope people take away from reading your book on Charles E. Hires?
Well, I just hope that he becomes less under-recognized and becomes more recognized, because he was a rather remarkable entrepreneur. And he was a real pioneer, and he was a Philly guy. So I would like people to know about that.
Yeah, and we should also mention that, you know, his original drugstore, his pharmacy at 6th and Spruce is there, but there is no historical marker that says this is where Charles E. Hires worked, and you know, he sort of was a pharmacist there. This is where he came up with the idea, perhaps, of for root beer. There is nothing there, or in South Jersey where he was born. There's really no historical marker.
No. The building on Spruce Street exists. It's been remodeled, but it's still there. It's a residence now. But certainly it would be nice to have a marker outside, as there are many other places in Philadelphia.
Yeah. What in the minute that we have left here, what would Charles Hires think today if he was to look back at his empire and not only with the soda and with root beer? What do you think his read would be, or his take would be on the business world today?
Well, he was a dyed-in-the-wool capitalist and entrepreneur, and he felt you could, as long as you kept your eyes open and you noticed things, there were opportunities out there, and you could seize them and pursue them, which he did in many instances. So he may be a little blind about how many people really have those opportunities, but I think he would still be very much in favor of business.
Yeah. Well, again, I learned a lot as a result of this program and doing my research for this program. The name of the book, again, is Charles E. Hires and the Drink That Wowed a Nation. It really did wow a nation. The Life and Times of a Philadelphia Entrepreneur by Bill Double. Bill Double has been my guest. This is what the book looks like here. You can go on Amazon. You can find the book on Amazon. And you can also go to Bill's website, which is billdouble.net.
Yes, or Temple University Press.
Okay, you can find the book there. So again, my thanks for Bill for being with us here on the program, shedding some insight into the mind behind Hires Root Beer and so many other businesses here in the greater Philadelphia area. Until the next time, my name is Paul Perrello. Thanks so much for being with us here on this program that we call The Philly Factor.